Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have knitting projects from the recently started to the absolutely completed. I have a spinning update and I have a sewing update. So let's get started. So I've got three knitting things to talk about. One is a completed project. One is a project where I've done all of the knitting, not quite done with some of the seaming, and then I've got a brand new project. So let's start with what I finished. Years ago, when my daughter was in college, she wanted a hot water bottle, and so I bought two of them off of Amazon. There was a package of them, and I knit a cover for it, and I gave it to her probably for the holidays that year. And she has used that ever since. So it's been almost 12 years. Every time I see that she uses it every day, she's kind of shaved the knitted cover a few times because it would get really pilly. And I was reorganizing some things in my office recently, and I came across that second water bottle. And I asked her, do you need a new water bottle? Because they're going to be here the end of August, beginning of September. And so I said, do you need a new water bottle? And would you like me to knit a cover for it? Or is that something you'd like to do? Because she is a knitter now. And she said she'd love a new water bottle and that it was my choice about whether I wanted to knit the cover or not. And I decided I did want to. Now, I couldn't remember at first where I got the pattern or how I did it. I remember it was something that I kind of was trying on the water bottle as I went. And I looked in my old Ravelry project notebook and I found it. And so I found the pattern. The pattern is called All You Need, a Classic by London Leo. I will leave a link down below. And it's basically customizable. It has diagrams, very easy to follow, tell you how the process for doing it, so that you start at the bottom with maybe this stitches this wide right here because of the way the contours are, and then there's these rounded corners, and so then you do enough increases to make it wide enough for the entire water bottle, and then you go up until it's a certain amount less than the total length that you need, and then you are doing decreases at the neck, and the neck is this wide, and so you will be able to get the water bottle in through the neck. The neck is done with ribbing, and so it pulls in to hold it snugly, but it absolutely, stretches this wide, and so you fold the water bottle kind of this way in order to slide it into the hole after the whole thing is complete. And so you can knit the little turtleneck as long as you want. So it was pretty easy. I knew she loves this color. I had two different yarns in this color, and I felt that this particular yarn would stand up to pilling more easily than the other one. The other one was Malabrigo Rios, I think, basically the same color, but Malabrigo Rios is a merino wool that is like a single. It's not plied or anything, and this particular yarn is a lot smoother and is going to be more resistant. This is Cascade Venezia in the worsted weight. It might be discontinued. I happen to have it because of the way that this yarn is constructed. I used it a couple of years ago as an example for a technique video. It is a cable plied yarn. So it will have all of the little tiny thin singles will be plied together, so you have a two-ply. So the singles have a Z twist. For you, it's going to look like this. So the way it's twisted, it's going to look like this. This is Z twist because that's like the middle part of this of a Z. And then when you ply those two singles together, you ply them in the other direction, the S direction. So that's where it usually ends with a plied yarn. But this is cable plied, which means you take a bunch of those little two strands and then you ply them again back in the Z direction. So sometimes you'll see those S plied two plies are twisted together again in the S direction, and you get those really round multi-strand yarns. But in this case, it's not plied again in the S direction. It's plied instead back in the opposite direction. I'll go to the overhead so that you can see what this kind of yarn looks like, and I'll pull it apart a little bit so you can see. So if you look at this yarn up close, it has this kind of textured look. It's very round and it has this kind of textured surface to it, and that comes from having it twisted and plied in back and forth in different directions. So if we untwist this, okay, so I need to twist it this way, and then you can start to kind of see that they get parallel. And if I start pulling this apart, you can see that there's a whole bunch of these little tiny strands. But each of these little tiny strands is a 2-ply yarn. And if you look, you can see that the twist is going to the left this way. So that's an S twist. If you untwist the 2 plies, then the singles would have a twist to the right. So they have a Z twist. So you take all of these S-plied strands, and then you put them together and you twist them in the Z direction, and then that's how you end up with this kind of a yarn. So the next project I want to talk about is that bulky weight cardigan with the shawl collar that I was knitting. The knitting went pretty quick on this, so it's just a few weeks. I always do spreadsheets on my sweaters so that I can kind of get an idea about how many stitches there are and how long it's going to take, but also as I'm working through each skein, I can see, well, how many stitches did I get with this, and am I going to have enough for the sweater, to make sure that I can plan for things like, well, maybe I need to make something shorter or something like that. There wasn't going to be any chance of me getting more of this yarn. I had got it as a door prize in early March at our guild's retreat, and then I dyed it. So I wouldn't have been able to get more of it and dyed it so that it would be exactly the same. So I really needed to work with what I had. So I knit all of the pieces, have been done for a couple of weeks, and then I just forgot about it. It needed to be seamed together, and I just didn't think about it. It's been so hot here. It's the middle of summer. This is a bulky weight sweater that I'm not going to wear until probably end of October, beginning of November. So I didn't think about it till the other day. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to seam this up. So I have one side seam seamed up. Usually the way I like to do sort of the order of operations for seaming, the way that I like to do it is I like to sew the sleeve caps in first, so that this was knit flat, so that I could, lay the pieces flat, and then I could sew in that tricky sleeve cap, because that's going to be curved, and yet the sleeve opening is going to be more straight. It's just easier, I find, to sew the sleeve cap in first. And then I will sew, the sleeve from cuff to underarm and the side from hem to underarm. Either order is okay, but I do both of them starting at the hem that's very visible so I can make sure it's even, and then I end at the underarm so that if there's any discrepancy anywhere, it's hidden in the underarm. When I sat down to seam it, I seamed up the right side first, thinking that the sleeves were knit in the round for some reason, and which would mean that, I would want to seam it up so that I'd have the circle of the armhole. And I realized that's not what you did, Roxanne. So I worked on the left side. I got the left sleeve in and I sewed that up. So that's all done. And then I have that right side. I might take the right side out a bit in order to get the sleeve in a little bit more easily, but I wanted to be able to try it on to make sure it was going to fit. So the pattern, I was trying to choose between two sizes because they jump by, I think, 4 inches per size, something like that. And I was kind of, what I wanted in terms of the finished size was kind of between the two. And it's a bulky cardigan. I didn't want it to be too fitted. It needs to have some room. And when I did my gauge swatch, I realized that instead of getting 3 stitches per inch, I was getting a little bit less than that, which meant my stitches were bigger, which means that using the stitch counts in the pattern, the pieces would end up a little bit bigger, just a little bit. And that was going to give me the extra 1.5 inches I needed, and so that was great. So I will try this on very briefly because it's a very warm sweater and it is summertime here, so that you can see what it looks like and I can tell you more about it. I still have the yarn that I was using for seaming, some gray sock yarn. This is bulky yarn and it's not plied, so it's not super strong, but it is very thick. And so I used sock yarn to seam it up with, so that wouldn't add any extra bulk. So this comes down, you know, right down here where I wanted it. It's plenty roomy, it's not too tight. And then you can see down here, the shawl collar is what I really love. It's a very wide shawl collar. I really like the construction of it. It had 2 sets of short rows. So you worked short rows for a while to make it wider, then you worked straight for a few rows, and then you did another set of short rows. So that made this collar really thick, and it's exactly what I wanted. So I do need to get 4 buttons. I was looking for buttons the other day at the fabric store. I didn't find anything exactly what I wanted. These holes are pretty big. I'm thinking about toggle buttons in black or a dark brown. I'll have to see what goes well with that. But I like that the sleeve is slightly long to make it a little bit warmer. I really like the fit. It's exactly what I wanted. I couldn't be happier with the fit. I'm not going to be wearing this for many months, so I'm not in a huge hurry to get it finished, but I am going to get it finished sooner rather than later. So I'm really pleased with this sweater. I am going to finish seaming it up and I'll keep an eye out for buttons. I'm not in a huge hurry because it's beginning of August. It'll be 3 months before I can wear this sweater. So if you have ideas about buttons, I'd like to hear them. I don't want anything that has too much weight to it. This sweater is very light in actual weight, even though it's bulky weight yarn. The yarn is Brooklyn Tweed Quarry. It's a woolen spun yarn, which means it has a lot more air in it than a worsted spun plied type of yarn. 200 yards and 100 grams. So that's almost like worsted weight yardage, but it's bulky weight. So the sweater just doesn't weigh very much, which means it's not going to be dragging down, which means it's not going to get too out of shape just from the weight of it. I have another sweater that is similar in that way, where it's a bulky weight yarn, but it was made with a chainette yarn, which has a lot of yardage, a lot more, twice as much yardage as you would normally expect. And I did not need to reinforce the button band on that because it just holds itself up, and the buttons I used for that one were very lightweight as well. So the buttons aren't dragging or stretching anything out. So those are some things I'm thinking about, making sure that the buttons themselves aren't so heavy and aren't going to drag the fabric down. If they are heavy buttons, then I'll probably reinforce the back of the band with some grosgrain ribbon. But I might even just look for something big and round, nut that doesn't weigh too much, and see how that goes. Our Guild's big yarn over event is going to be in September, and there's always at least one vendor that's there with tons of buttons, like vintage buttons. And so I might wait. If I don't see anything that I just love, I just might wait until September to find buttons for that, when I can shop at Yarn Over for that event. The new project I have been working on is another sweater. I have maybe 5 or 6 sweaters quantity of yarn in my stash, and I don't really have a huge stash these days. I've been really working hard at bringing it down and making sure I'm using yarn in my stash whenever possible. And because mostly what I'm knitting is socks and sweaters, that's the kind of yarn I have in my stash. This sweater is one that I have been wanting to knit since I first started, or shortly after I started my project, that long-term 4-year project to knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to 1990s. During that time, I was kind of researching, well, how far back do what we would consider a sweater, how far back do they actually go? And my project at that time was to work from published patterns. And so the earliest published patterns for sweaters were in, like, I have found some now that were in the 1880s, but really it was the 1890s. Those were the earliest ones I could find when I was working on the project. And prior to that, there were people that were knitting things that we would consider sweaters. They just didn't publish patterns for them. They were teaching each other how to knit those. So like if you think of the Ganseys from Northeast Great Britain and through Scotland, and then also the Netherlands, those are a product of kind of the mid 19th century. They didn't have them before that. So one of the places that I found that were good resources for these traditional sweaters, this book right here, it's called Knitting in the Old Way. The first edition was just written by Priscilla Gibson Roberts. The second edition that's expanded was Priscilla Gibson Roberts and Deborah Robson. And so it has all of the things that you think of as traditional sweaters, like Norwegian sweaters, Faroe sweaters, Ganseys, Icelandic sweaters, all those different kinds of constructions and kind of the formulas for how you do them. So that's a good resource. But the other thing that I found was a master's thesis where this woman was looking at basically the family tree, the history of sweaters in different regions in Europe, and what elements were unique about sweaters from this place versus that place. And really, most of them are a product of the 19th century or later. So many things that we think of as traditional and has been around forever, mid 20th century, like Aran sweaters, 1930s. Icelandic sweaters, the way we think of them with those yokes, 1950s to 60s. So they don't go back as far as people believe, especially if there's some sort of mythology attached to them. There is one sweater that we would actually think of as a sweater, and that is the traditional Danish sweater. So I came across this book by Vivian Huxbro. She is a Danish designer, and she's written lots of books, and she teaches. And she's like Mitch, she's not a historian, but she went to all of these different folk museums all over Denmark and maybe even further out, because Denmark owned other lands that were sort of adjacent at different times. There was a sweater, sometimes it's called the night sweater or the star sweater, and it's called a night sweater as opposed to something that would have been a day sweater, or something only worn during the day, like would be really fancy, made from silk or whatever, that wealthy people would only wear during the day, because the more common people didn't distinguish that much between what they wore at night versus what they wore during the day. And this sweater was one of the layers that they wore. And so you could see parts of it. You might be able to see the sleeves or part of it in all of the layers that they were wearing. And they would be highly embellished, even though most people wouldn't see that. It's like wearing fancy underwear. You know you're wearing it. And if you are making it, it's going to be entertaining for you to make something more interesting. And so they were solid color. And they had knit purl patterns is how they were created. So if you think about Ganseys, and they have those cables, but then they have a lot of knit purl patterns, a lot of times when people see these Danish sweaters, they think, oh, those are like Ganseys. Really, it's the Ganseys are like the Danish night sweaters. When knitting was coming into Europe and the aristocracy was buying all the fancy silk knitted things from Spain or southern Italy or France, and knitting hadn't really come up into the northern climate areas of Europe yet, at least at that level, they would buy their fancy knitted things from these places. So King Charles, and I can never remember if it's the first or the second, the one that was executed, he was wearing this silk, they called it a vest or undershirt. It wasn't a top layer. And he wore that to his execution because it was cold and he didn't want to be shivering and have people think that he was scared. That shirt, I think, is in the Museum of London or London Museum. It's silk and it has all this knit purl pattern on it, like 15, 20 stitches an inch type of knitting. So that style of garment became very popular amongst the wealthy classes, and it made its way across into Denmark. And then the poorer people, the more common people, adopted that sort of look, but knitted in wool and at a thicker gauge, more like fingering weight type of yarn. So that's what is in this book. There's a lot of like history at the beginning. There's all these pictures of the different types of sweaters. So these go back long before that you see the mid-19th century sweaters like Ganseys appearing. And so that's why this has always really appealed to me, wanting to do this. So the first part, there's a lot of reference or history, talking about the way people knitted, showing pictures of preserved garments and how you can tell how old they are based on how long they are. So originally they were quite long, and then as you get into sort of the early 1800s, they started to get shorter. So you can kind of date when those sweaters were knit based on that. So what people would do is they would knit them up and then they would take them to whoever the person was in their village who did the dyeing, and they would often dye them in like red or green or blue. And the color might signify, maybe it might be seasonal, or it might signify whether somebody was married versus not married. But they were tended to be dyed a single color. Red, green, or blue were really common. So after all of the history and the pictures and all that kind of information, then there's a section of stitch dictionaries, and I will show you some on the screen here. So there are star patterns, because that sort of, is it 6 or 8 pointed star? 8 pointed star that you see so much in Norwegian stranded color work. They use those kinds of stars a lot, but in knit purl patterns, and there's all different kinds. So there's these star patterns, and then there are horizontal bands, and there's vertical bands, and traveling bands or cables, that kind of thing. All of those different things. And then the back of the book, she has examples from her students who have designed sweaters for themselves in their size. And it has all the information about the yarn that they use and the gauge and the construction and which stitch patterns they use and what pages they're on in this book. And there was one sweater in here that I really liked. It was called Annie's sweater. And I will show it to you on the screen. I have loved this one since the beginning. I just really, really liked it, but it looked like it was going to be a little too small for me, and it's only in one size because that woman designed it for herself. And a few years ago, I thought, oh, I'm going to make a Danish night sweater. I'm going to use some of my sweater yarn that I have here stashed, because I have worsted weight is what I usually use to make sweaters, and I found a color I liked. I'm going to make that sweater, and then I realized, oh no, these are meant to be knit with fingering weight. And I have a lot of fingering weight, but I have a lot of single skeins of fingering weight. And so that was something where I knew I would need to buy the yarn for it. So last year, when our guild had Yarn Over, there's a marketplace, a free marketplace open to the public as part of the Yarn Over weekend. And so that was my goal, was to find some yarn that I could use to knit one of these Danish night sweaters. The yarn I found was from a local dyer here, and it's called Rewa Fibers, and it's 100% Tibetan yak down. And this particular yarn is called Haven. It's a 2-ply fingering weight, and the color is called Between Worlds. So it is a semi-solid. There's some little bit of variation because it's hand dyed. And it's been sitting here in my office since last September. And so when I finished the bulky weight sweater and I was like, okay, what am I going to knit next? I decided I wanted to do this Danish night sweater. And originally I had thought well, I really liked the one sweater called Annie's sweater, but I thought I'm going to design my own. But then I looked at Annie's sweater again, and before I thought it was too small. Okay, I would need to modify it to make it a little bigger. But I'm smaller now than I was, and so it actually looks like it would be exactly the right size for me. And so I did a gauge swatch. I was getting exactly the right gauge. So I'm like, I'm just going to knit this sweater because there's a lot to learn about these sweaters and how they're constructed and how the patterns play out in these sweaters, because it's very different from something that has a lot of vertical panels like an Aran sweater or even like a lace sweater. There's, you know, you have a split hem at the base, so it's kind of vented and you have to join them together with some overlap. And then there's a horizontal stitch pattern. And then you know, this particular sweater's got some vertical bands going up on either side. And then it has the stars in the middle, but they're different stars. There's 3 different big stars in the front. And then in the back, because the back comes up on the neck higher, there's these same 3 stars and then a smaller one at the top of the neck. I thought this has got so much in it and it's going to be so interesting to knit that I just decided to knit that particular sweater instead of designing one myself, at least for this this time around. I charted it all out. I used StitchMastery to chart my patterns, and a lot of times I'm just doing, if it's the vertical panels, I'll do like a section of it so I can see how everything lays out side to side. And I don't necessarily need to chart out the entire length of the sweater. I, you know, cut until I get to, okay, at the underarm, I'll have all my shaping, I'll chart that out. This one, I needed to chart the whole thing because the stars are all different. You know, the pattern changes throughout the entire sweater. So that took quite a while to chart all that out. And then I did my spreadsheet, and this sweater has 75,000 stitches. So a 50 to 60,000 stitch sweater, I can usually knit all the way through. Fingering weight sweaters, I usually end up having to break it up because I get tired of it. But this sweater is interesting enough that we'll see if I can just continue working all the way through. So I knit the sleeve. The sleeve has this kind of diamond pattern all over, and apparently it's pretty common to have one of these kind of traveling patterns like this on the sleeves. This is not a pattern that's on the body though. So I finished knitting it, and even though I knew I had the right gauge, the sleeve seemed to come out a little bit too short. And so then I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to adjust things. How am I going to adjust something vertically in length for this body when there's these very specific motifs that have to happen? So I decided to wash and block this and see what happened once it was washed and blocked, because it kind of looked a bit more quilted, you know, puffier with the knit purl patterns when it was first knit, but it did flatten out after it was washed, and I got the perfect length now. So let me put the sleeve on and I can show you what it looks like. So this is the sleeve. So this is a very simple construction in many ways. That they do start with the sleeves and then they start with the body bottom up. This is a body that's knit in the round. And the way a lot of them were knit would be, you would, you know, when you split for the sleeves, you knit the front up to the point where you get to the bottom of the neck, where you'd have the bind off for the neck. And then when you knit the back, you would just continue the shoulder straps over the top and then have that meet. So you'd have these seams on the side. This one isn't going to be like that, but I did think that that was interesting how they constructed those in order to get them to fit, like the order of what they knit and how they did that. So it's a really interesting book. I'd encourage you, if you can, check it out of your library or even buy it. I'll leave a link down. I'll leave like an Amazon link down below so you can see it, but you might be able to get it through your library or some other way to borrow it, because it's a really interesting book. Tour de France was through like the first 3 weeks of July-ish, about the very last day, I think, of June, and then the first 3 weeks of July. And I started out gangbusters with that. I got some things finished that I wanted to get finished. I wanted to try out the quill attachment on my e-spinner and try spindle spinning. I wanted to try that. It's sort of like the kind of spinning that you would do if you were using a grate wheel. And I wanted to try it and get the hang of it. And I thought, oh, this was actually easier than I thought it would be. But I was having trouble. Part of the long draw is, you know, you're pulling things back in this way, and it was kind of bothering me. My shoulder had been bothering, not really my shoulder, but my upper arm had been bothering me for a couple months, and it was really bad at the beginning of June. I couldn't even reach up to get anything out of a cabinet, and then something like snapped or popped and released that tension, but it was still sore. It wasn't getting any better. So I went to the doctor last week. It was a physician's assistant. Then she's referring me for an MRI, and I went to physical therapy. And the physician's assistant had an idea of what it might be, but she thought you don't have the normal risk factors for that. She was talking about frozen shoulder, but she's like, I don't have diabetes or hypothyroidism. I didn't have like surgery or a break or any traumatic injury to my arm. And that's typically more often that's, you know, what happens to create something called frozen shoulder. The physical therapist checked me out. It's not a rotator cuff. My rotator cuff is absolutely fine, and she thinks it's frozen shoulder, but until we get the MRI next week, we won't know for sure, but we think that's what it is. So I've been doing physical therapy. So yeah, I can do up and down. It's like the lateral stuff. So like, can't wash under my arm, you know, I can't, you know, there's certain things I can't do. And like one of them is like long draw spinning. It just hurts. Even when I was seaming up my sweater today and I had a long length of yarn, I was pulling out to the side and it was, ugh. So, you know, I was having to pull it this way instead. Apparently you can recover from this, but it might take a couple of years. So the first part is working it so then the pain goes away, and then you have to work on re-strengthening it. So there's the freezing, the frozen, the thawing. So I'm working on that. So I'm limited by some things I can do, and I'm just trying to figure out, you know, making sure that I'm not hurting myself, but also stretching. So the spinning kind of went off the rails a little bit this past month, and it's summertime, and we got interested in some DIY home projects and, you know, a bunch of stuff around the house too, with some of that you can't do in the winter. So taking advantage of the summer. So spinning, not a lot of progress. And as things get better, because people were asking, can you show like doing that quill on the e-spinner? And I will absolutely do that. I'm hoping sooner rather than later. We'll just see how things go with my my shoulder first. But that's my spinning update. Not a lot, unfortunately. So I kind of took, I don't know, 3-4 weeks break on sewing, and I was looking forward to a class that I was going to start this week. It goes until September. It's once a week. It's a pants fitting class. So I'd made myself a pair of pants earlier this summer. They came out a little big. I wasn't crazy about them. They had a nice flat front. I really liked the front, and the pockets were really cool. It's the Pietra pant. I wasn't crazy about the gathered elastic on the back. It's just not a look that I like. I really wanted to sew pants like the ones that I normally wear. And sometimes they have a zipper, sometimes they don't, but I wanted pants that were more like that. And I saw that there was a class being offered at the shop where I've taken classes before on pants fitting, and the idea was we're going to draft our own pair of pants. So the first class we did our pattern block, and it wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting we were going to take our measurements and then we're going to draw everything out. You know, you do the math, like you have this measurement, and then you go from here to here, and you do, you know, this and that and the other thing. And that's not what it was. We started with a template. And so she had heard about this kit, basically, from the 1970s from a friend of hers who works at a place in St. Paul called the James Hill House. It's like a historic building. They have a lot of historical stuff. That woman does like the costumes and stuff. And so Michelle, my teacher, had found out from this other woman about this sort of system from the 70s for drafting pants that are a lot easier than doing it all manually. You take your measurements and you use this template and you can create your own outline. It's just a lot faster, and I couldn't imagine it. I didn't really understand it until I saw what we were doing. Somebody in the class had taken a similar class from the woman who had suggested these 1970s pattern. And the problem was that you're borrowing this kit to create your custom pattern block, but then if you change sizes or if you want to make them pants for somebody else, you don't have the template to start with. And so there are two women who had taken this class before, like 3 years before, from this other woman. And they were saying, oh, I wish that that company would republish these kits, you know, because you can get them on eBay, but they, you know, they are from the 70s. And so some of the silhouette and the way the waistline is placed is very 70s. And so we had to kind of modify that for our class. And I said, you know, this kind of reminds me, there's this woman who's like Glenda the Good Stitch, and I couldn't remember the name of her system. It's called SureFit Designs. And I've seen a lot of her YouTube videos, and I've thought about buying her sort of kits before, but I didn't really understand how they worked either. But I thought, this seems like it's the same as that. I went on online and I just Googled for this American Fashion Institute pants that fit or something like that. And I found there are just tons of these vintage kits available all over the place for about $15. So I found somebody on Etsy who had not only one of those, but also one like for shirts or something like that for $30 for the two of them. And they said, doesn't look like either one of them has ever been used. So I thought, that's good. They're in good condition. So I ordered those. And then I thought, oh, I should go look on patternreview.com. It's like a sewing pattern thing. You can find out reviews for sewing machines or sewing patterns. There's forums, there's all kinds of things. So I wonder if anybody has talked about this. I bet a lot of people are longtime sewers. They might have used this. And so I looked in the forums, and then somebody mentioned that this Glenda, the Good Stitch, who has SureFit Designs, bought the rights to that original 1970s thing from that guy who did it. And so it is the same thing, but it is a little bit more modern. So then I ordered the pants kit from her too, and I'm going to compare the templates and see, because the tools are very much the same. So it'll be interesting to see how the templates differ, but it also will be really nice to have access to all of those videos that she's done on how you make modifications, because I've been looking at a lot of her videos for modifying, you know, for crotch depth or crotch, you know, if you need to cut horizontally more, or do you need it to be longer this way, like how do you need to alter things. So we'll see how much altering I need. I don't think I'm going to need a ton. I do think that I'm going to need a longer back crotch, because I do have a bit of a booty and my stomach is more flat. So I do think there probably will be some adjustment there. But it'll be really interesting to go through this process. So if any of you have used that, the old one, the guy is called like Dusan or something like that. It's American Fashion Institute. I'll put pictures on the screen so you can see what that looks like. Or if you have used the SureFit Designs thing to kind of draft your own patterns, that would be great. One of the reasons I hesitated before was because I'm like, I don't have the imagination to come up with, well, I'm going to do this with this neckline or that neckline or this, you know, I don't have the ability to do that, at least not yet. But I do know what styles of like pants I like and what I like the leg to look like or what length I want and how I want it to fit. So I think that will be something that could really work for me, but be interested to know if any of you have used that system and what you think of it. Because yeah, I'm not looking to be, you know, on trend fashionista. I'm looking to make pants and capris and whatever that that fit me, and then learn how to adjust based on the fabric that I'm using, if it has some stretch or no stretch, that kind of thing. So let me know down in the comments if you've used that Sure Fit, or if you've used that old American Fashion Institute pants fitting kit before. Let me know. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.